War is often imagined as a clash of steel, a storm of bullets and explosions under a blazing sun, but on the brutal fronts of World War II, especially in the unforgiving landscapes of Eastern Europe, soldiers faced a more insidious and relentless enemy. The cold. Winter descended not just as a season but as a weapon. Temperatures plummeted to unimaginable lows, turning the very air into a physical threat. For countless young men, far from home and ill-prepared for the ferocity of a continental winter, the greatest danger wasn't always the soldier on the other side of the line, it was the silent, creeping frost that promised a slow, agonizing defeat. Imagine being in a foxhole, the world outside a stark canvas of white and gray. The wind howls like a predator, slicing through every layer of clothing you possess. Your breath freezes in crystalline clouds before your eyes. In this environment, survival becomes a minute-by-minute battle. The objective shifts from winning the war to simply seeing the next sunrise. This was the grim reality for troops caught in the icy grip of campaigns like the Battle of the Bulge or the Eastern Front. They learned quickly that freezing temperatures were more than just uncomfortable. They were a lethal force that could disable an army more effectively than any artillery barrage. The human body is a remarkable machine, but it has its limits. When exposed to extreme cold, it fights desperately to preserve its core temperature. Blood is pulled away from the extremities, hands, feet, nose, and ears, to protect vital organs. This is the first stage of a catastrophic shutdown. Frostbite begins its grim work, turning flesh black and dead. Hypothermia follows, a deceptive state where shivering gives way to confusion, lethargy, and a false sense of warmth. Men would lie down in the snow, feeling peaceful for the first time in days, and never get up again. This invisible killer stalked the battlefields, claiming thousands without firing a single shot. These soldiers were pushed to the absolute edge of human endurance. They were not just fighting a war against other men, they were fighting a war against nature itself, in its most hostile form. The stories from these fronts are filled with accounts of unimaginable hardship, where the simple act of staying warm became the most complex and critical mission of all. The enemy wasn't just over the next hill, it was in the air they breathed, the ground they slept on, and the very fabric of the uniforms they wore. This desperate struggle for warmth would force them to rediscover a piece of ancient simple wisdom that had been forgotten in the age of modern warfare. When you think of a soldier's kit, you imagine it's the best gear available. Governments pour millions into equipping their armies, and in theory, every piece of equipment is designed for performance and protection. During World War II, the standard-issue winter gear for many armies consisted of wool greatcoats, wool blankets, leather boots, and layers of cotton undergarments. In a dry, cool climate, this setup worked reasonably well. Wool is a fantastic natural insulator, and a thick coat can provide a solid barrier against the wind. But the battlefields of a European winter were rarely dry. They were a miserable mix of snow, sleet, melting ice, and mud. This is where the standard gear began to fail, and fail catastrophically. The primary problem was moisture. Wool is excellent at insulating when it's dry, but once it gets wet, it becomes incredibly heavy and loses a significant amount of its insulating properties. A soldier trudging through miles of snow would inevitably get wet, either from the outside environment or from his own sweat. His heavy wool coat would become a sodden, icy shell that actually pulled heat away from his body. Instead of protecting him, his uniform became a major liability, actively contributing to the onset of hypothermia. It was a cruel paradox. The very equipment meant to save him was helping to kill him. The situation with footwear was even more dire. The standard leather boots were tough, but they were not waterproof. Once moisture seeped in, a soldier's socks and feet would become soaked. In freezing temperatures, this was a recipe for disaster. Wet feet lose heat at an alarming rate, leading to a condition known as trench foot. This agonizing affliction caused by prolonged exposure to cold, damp conditions could lead to nerve damage, tissue decay, and in severe cases, amputation. Soldiers would try to dry their socks over small fires, but often they would just scorch them, or they would have to put them back on still damp, starting the vicious cycle all over again. Even the simple act of sleeping became a life-threatening ordeal. A wool blanket, like the greatcoat, was a poor defense against the damp cold of a makeshift bunker or foxhole. Lying on the frozen ground, a soldier's body heat would slightly melt the snow or ice beneath him, creating a damp patch. The wetness would soak into his blanket, rendering it almost useless as an insulator. He would shiver through the night, burning precious calories just to stay alive, waking up more exhausted and colder than when he went to sleep. The gear they were issued was designed for a different kind of war, and on the frozen front lines, it was proving to be a fatal miscalculation. In the face of technological failure, when modern military equipment was proving worse than useless, soldiers turned to a solution that was as old as civilization itself. It wasn't a new invention or a secret weapon developed in a lab. It was simple, abundant, and often found right there on the battlefield in abandoned farms and barns. This unlikely savior was straw. The dry, hollow stalks of cereal plants like wheat, barley, or rye became one of the most effective survival tools on the winter front. To the uninitiated, it looked like nothing more than discarded agricultural waste. But to the freezing soldiers, it was as valuable as gold. The discovery wasn't a formal command from high up, it was born from pure desperation and observation. Soldiers noticed that farm animals could survive brutal winters huddled together in barns bedded with deep layers of straw. They saw how local peasants who had endured these winters for generations used straw to insulate their homes and even their clothing. It was a classic case of grassroots innovation. A soldier, shivering in a damp trench, might have desperately grabbed a handful of straw from a nearby field to stuff inside his coat, only to discover that it made a remarkable difference. This knowledge would have spread like wildfire through the ranks, a whisper from one freezing man to another. What made straw so brilliant was its simplicity and availability. In the agricultural landscapes of Europe, it was everywhere. While supply lines struggled to deliver extra blankets or specialized winter gear, straw could be scavenged locally. An abandoned barn could provide enough insulation for an entire platoon. This accessibility was crucial. A survival tool is only useful if you have it when you need it most. Soldiers didn't need to wait for a quartermaster. They could actively improve their situation with their own hands, using materials found in their immediate environment. This empowered them, giving them a small measure of control in a situation that was otherwise completely overwhelming. The contrast between the failing military issue gear and this simple natural material was stark. The heavy wet wool coat was a burden, while a jacket stuffed with light dry straw was a lifesaver. The cold, damp leather boots led to trench foot, but boots lined with straw could keep feet warm and dry. A thin wool blanket on the frozen ground was a recipe for hypothermia, but a deep bed of straw provided a thick, dry barrier that allowed for restful, life-sustaining sleep. This humble organic material was outperforming the products of an industrial military complex, proving that sometimes the simplest solutions are the most effective. So, what is the secret behind straw's incredible insulating power? It's not magic, it's simple physics. The core principle of insulation is trapping air. Air itself is a poor conductor of heat, which means it doesn't transfer heat very well. When you can trap a layer of still air around your body, you create a buffer zone. Your body heat warms up this trapped air, and because it can't escape easily, it forms a protective thermal barrier between you and the cold outside. This is how most modern insulating materials, from fiberglass in your attic to the down in a winter jacket, work. They are designed to create thousands of tiny air pockets. Straw is a natural master of this principle. Each individual stalk of straw is hollow, which means it has a pocket of air trapped right inside it. When you pile a large amount of straw together, you create a loose, three-dimensional matrix. This structure creates countless additional pockets of air between the individual stalks. So, when a soldier stuffed his jacket with straw or burrowed into a deep pile of it to sleep, he was surrounding himself with a massive, multi-layered system of trapped air. This was far more effective than the tightly woven fabric of a wool blanket, which has far less space to trap air, especially when it becomes compressed or wet. The second critical advantage of straw is its ability to manage moisture. Unlike cotton, which absorbs water like a sponge, or wool, which becomes heavy and loses its loft when wet, straw has a natural resistance to absorbing moisture. Its waxy outer surface helps to repel water. More importantly, because of the vast amount of air space within a pile of straw, it has excellent breathability. This means that moisture from a soldier's body, sweat, could pass through the straw and away from his skin, a process known as wicking. This kept his skin and base layers of clothing drier, which is absolutely critical for preventing heat loss. A soldier sleeping on a bed of straw experienced these two benefits directly. The thick layer of straw underneath him created a substantial barrier, preventing the cold and dampness of the frozen ground from leaching away his body heat through conduction. At the same time, any perspiration he produced during the night could escape through the breathable straw, rather than being trapped against his body by a non-breathable ground sheet or a wet blanket. The result was a warmer, drier, and safer night's sleep. This simple, natural material provided a complete thermal regulation system that was perfectly adapted for survival in damp, freezing conditions. On the ground, soldiers developed a range of practical and ingenious ways to use straw to combat the cold. These techniques became an unofficial field manual for winter survival, passed from veteran to rookie. The most fundamental use was for bedding. In bunkers, foxholes, and trenches, the first order of business was to lay down a thick foundation of straw, at least a foot deep if possible. This created a raised, dry platform that insulated them from the frozen earth. Soldiers would then burrow into the straw, covering themselves with it like a thick organic duvet. It was far superior to a single blanket on the cold, hard ground. Clothing was the next frontier for straw-based innovation. Soldiers would stuff straw into every available space in their uniforms. They would line their greatcoats and field jackets with it, creating a bulky but incredibly warm outer layer. This makeshift insulation mimicked the principle of a modern down-filled parka. They would also stuff straw down their trousers, wrapping it around their legs to protect them from the biting wind. It was itchy and rustled when they moved, but that was a small price to pay for warmth. This simple act transformed their standard-issue uniforms from inadequate garments into effective personal survival systems. Perhaps the most critical application was in their boots. As mentioned, trench foot was a rampant and debilitating problem. To combat it, soldiers would line their leather boots with a generous handful of straw before putting them on. This had a dual effect. Firstly, the straw trapped a layer of warm air, insulating their feet from the cold that radiated up from the frozen ground. Secondly, and just as importantly, the straw absorbed any moisture, wicking sweat away from their socks and skin. At the end of the day, a soldier could pull out the damp straw and replace it with a fresh, dry handful for the night, ensuring his feet stayed much drier and warmer. Even shelters were improved with straw. Soldiers would weave it into makeshift mats to hang over the entrances to their dugouts, creating a door that blocked the wind but still allowed for some ventilation. They would pack it against the inner walls of their bunkers to add an extra layer of insulation, reducing heat loss and making the small space much more habitable. In every aspect of their daily struggle for survival, from sleeping to standing guard, straw was integrated into their routines. It wasn't just an emergency measure, it became a standard, essential part of life on the winter front, a testament to human ingenuity in the face of extreme adversity. The adoption of straw as a survival tool was a classic example of bottom-up learning within a large organization. There were no official memos or training manuals distributed by high command detailing the correct way to stuff your boots with straw. This knowledge was pure fieldcraft, developed and refined in the crucible of the front lines. It spread organically, through word of mouth. A seasoned sergeant would show a new replacement how to properly bed down in a foxhole. A soldier who had survived the previous winter would share the trick of lining his coat with a fellow infantryman shivering on watch. This unofficial knowledge became a form of currency, a shared wisdom that built camaraderie and saved lives. It represented a departure from the rigid, top-down structure of the military. In the fight against the cold, rank and regulation mattered less than practical experience. A private who knew how to stay warm was more valuable than a general who didn't. This process created a powerful subculture of survivalists within the army. These soldiers learned to trust their own observations and ingenuity over the standard equipment they were issued. They became experts in improvising, adapting, and overcoming their environment. The effectiveness of these methods spoke for itself. Units that embraced these improvised techniques suffered fewer casualties from cold weather injuries, like frostbite and hypothermia. They maintained better morale and combat effectiveness because their soldiers were able to get some measure of restorative rest. The difference between a platoon that used straw and one that didn't could be the difference between a functional fighting unit and a collection of exhausted, freezing men. The lore of straw became ingrained in the collective memory of those who fought on the winter fronts. This knowledge was often specific to a particular theater of war. A soldier transferred from the deserts of North Africa to the forests of the Ardennes would have to learn a whole new set of survival skills, and fast. The veterans of the Eastern Front became the unwilling masters of this icy domain. Their hard-won lessons, learned at a terrible cost, became the unwritten rules for staying alive. The story of Straw is a powerful reminder that in war, some of the most important battles are not against the enemy, but against the elements, and the most effective weapons are sometimes the ones you find, not the ones you are given. The lessons learned in the frozen trenches of World War II are as relevant today as they were 80 years ago. We live in an age of incredible technology. We have GPS devices, satellite phones, and high-tech fabrics engineered in laboratories to provide warmth and waterproofing. It's easy to become complacent, to believe that our sophisticated gear makes us invincible in the outdoors. But technology can fail. Batteries die, electronics break, and even the most expensive waterproof jacket can be torn. When that happens, you are left with only your knowledge and your wits. The principle of using a simple, natural material like straw or dried leaves for insulation is a cornerstone of modern survival training. If you find yourself lost in the woods in cold weather, the first thing you should do is build a shelter. The most effective improvised shelters, known as debris huts, are built using this exact principle. You construct a frame, and then pile it high with a thick layer of dry leaves, pine needles, grass, and other natural debris. This creates a thick, insulated cocoon that traps your body heat, just as the soldiers did with straw. A well-built debris hut can keep you alive in freezing temperatures, even without a sleeping bag or a fire. This ancient wisdom highlights a fundamental truth of survival. Practical knowledge weighs nothing and can never be taken from you. Understanding the principles of insulation, knowing how to find and use natural materials, and being able to improvise are far more valuable than owning the most expensive gear. A person with a cheap plastic poncho and the knowledge to build a debris shelter is far better off than someone with a $1,000 tent who doesn't know how to use it properly in a storm. The soldiers of World War II learned this the hard way. Their survival depended not on their issued kit, but on their ability to adapt and use what the environment provided. In the end, the story of straw is a powerful lesson in humility and resourcefulness. It reminds us that nature provides its own solutions, and that the most effective tools are often the simplest ones. It teaches us to look beyond technology and to value the timeless skills that have allowed humans to survive in harsh environments for millennia. Whether you are a soldier, a hiker, or just someone who enjoys the great outdoors, remember the lesson of the winter front. When your gear fails, it is knowledge that will keep you alive. Trust your ingenuity, learn the principles, and never underestimate the power of a handful of straw.